outside of Atlanta or maybe into neighboring states. We did the same thing in Texas. We go down and shoot the Texas Stadium show when Kerry won the belt from Flair. And, we'd shoot a couple of shows before and after the event. We travel the circuit. And just get extra photos. While we're in the neighborhood, we'll shoot a couple extra shows.
Right.
But there really wasn't a whole lot of writing done on the road. And again, it was a lot harder back then. It wasn't like here I am in my old fart mode. But it's not like today where you could just pack a laptop in with your camera and off you go. It was a little different.
Yeah. So back then, again, so speaking about the importance of the magazines back then, how much were the promoters reaching out to you guys? I mean, sometimes, these days, when media wants to get an interview with a WWE wrestler or something like that, sometimes you sense it's almost like an inconvenience on their part. Like, all right. They, I imagine, really relied pretty heavily on coverage back then, so I think that they would have wanted you guys to be in touch with them. Maybe not necessarily WWE, but certainly some of these other promoters. So was there a lot of that? Was there a lot of schmoozing and that kind of thing?
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time. Well, yeah, I'm Bill Apter, king of the schmooze, right? But yeah, I think there was a lot of that. Like anything else, the analogy would be, I guess, if Entertainment Weekly is putting The Walking Dead on their cover for, this was the best TV show of 2014, they're probably getting calls from, showrunners of a dozen other shows. How come them? Why not us? Same kind of thing happened to us.
Yeah.
Jimmy Valiant would go on the cover of PWI, and someone get a call from Jimmy Valiant. That's great. I love the cover. But then you might get calls from 3 other promoters going, "What are you putting that guy on the cover for? Put my guy on the cover." So
right.
it was. I don't think there was any anger behind any of it. There wasn't. There wasn't a lot of heat, but it was more like, hey, next month, what do you think about Rock and Roll Express on the cover,
right.
or whoever else it might be.
Right.
So yeah, everybody was sort of lobbying for their own guys to go on the cover, or vice versa. If a guy maybe was coming to the end of their contract in a territory, they might not want their guy on the cover.
Really? Okay.
They might say, hey, he's not going to be around for more than another couple of weeks, so don't put him on the cover if you don't have to.
And would you guys monitor how well different guys would do on the cover? I know that some of it just kind of common sense. You knew a cover with a Hulk Hogan would do better than somebody else, that kind of thing. But were there metrics involved in that?
Yeah, well, we track sales very closely all the time. I guess it was the choice. I guess what you're really asking is, how do you choose who goes on the cover? Mm-hmm. And it was sort of a combination of things that you could measure and things that you sort of felt from the gut. So the things you could measure, you're exactly right. Hulk Hogan's going to sell a magazine. Road Warriors looking really mean. That's going to sell. Interestingly, there was sort of mixed reviews about whether blood sold on a cover.
Mm-hmm.
Some people thought it did. Some people thought it turned off more people than it brought in.
It definitely caught your eye on the newsstand.
It definitely caught your eye. I was always a fan of. See, I don't know that it was. I think that the cover photo itself was important, but to me, sort of the idea, the big headline on the cover or the big feature in the magazine was the thing that really sort of caught the eye and made the sale.
Yeah. I mentioned to Dan last week, but the one I remember, and again, growing up in WWF territory in the mid-'80s, was one that was a match between the two British Bulldogs. And it was unearthed, this match that people didn't know about. I guess it was old Calgary territory match between Davey Boy Smith and Dynamite Kid. And the photo on the cover was, I think, just a photo of the British Bulldogs. But the promise of that story, those two fought each other once. Exactly. Is what made you buy the magazine and read the story. Yeah.
Well, it's very, very similar to the way you hear internet marketers and content people talk about the web today, which is that with the magazines, you had 1 or 2 seconds to capture someone's attention and get them to pick up the magazine.
Right.
And that was done through the headline, primarily.
Yeah.
And if the headline worked well with the photo, even better. And if the headline was connected to some sort of huge chunk of content on the inside, let's say, that was best of all. I mean, I think the year-end issues were just the best example of that. And I loved working on the year-end issues. I mean, they were sort of one of my favorite things. So the year in review, I'll reveal a bit of a trade secret here.
We may have to
probably
have this out.
for the first time on this podcast, revealed for the first time ever publicly. That was pretty much a direct swipe from Esquire magazine.
Okay.
So anybody who's into magazines back in the 80s and the 70s and remembers Esquire had something called the Dubious Achievement Awards. And I loved them. I thought they were just one of the funniest. It was internet snark before there was the internet. Mm-hmm. And, each page was, 5 or 6 little tidbits with snarky headlines and a photo and a funny observation. And I said, we got to do that in the wrestling magazines. That's great. And that became one of the components of the year-end issue. And then you had, of course, all the awards was a huge piece of it. And then we started getting involved in lists and predictions. And over the years, the year-end issue grew to be something that was just phenomenal. Man, it was. I still have most of mine sitting in my closet.
Yeah, and I think it still is. I mean, I think even for people who haven't checked out the magazine in a while, that's still a destination issue. That and obviously the PWI 500, which I wanted to ask you about also. So I think 91 is the first time that run. Do you remember the idea? Do you remember the first conversation? How was it received? Are you guys crazy? How do we do this?
I'll tell you, I really don't remember the first PWI 500 to that specific. I want to say that the idea came from Stu Sachs. I think it did, but holy mackerel, it's one of those things that sort of blurred in the scrap heap of personal memory.
Yeah.
But I do remember thinking, oh my goodness, how are we going to come up with 500? How are we going to do that? To me, sort of the most interesting conversations were, of course, who's going to be number one? That was always
still is. Yeah.
Yeah, and then who's going to be 500?
Right.
Which was sort of the flip side of who's going to be number one. Was all right. Who's the person we're going to stick in the 500 spot?
Yeah.
Which over the years I think became sort of like a Rotten Tomatoes movie award or something.
Oh yeah, I mean we've all heard from guys who have lobbied like, look, don't put me in at, if you're going to put me in at 314, just put me in at 500. More people will see me there, that kind of thing.
499. Oh yeah. Man, missed it by one.
Yeah, we've had some legendary 500s over the years.
Lists are. There's a couple of great podcasts I listen to, tech podcasts, and I don't know if you're familiar with John C. Dvorak, who's a great tech journalist, and he's on a podcast, No Agenda, which is a political thing. He's usually on This Week in Tech, but he's a magazine guy from the tech side for forever, and he always talks about magazines and lists, and his take on it is lists are just sort of an easy thing to do. It's the top 10 this, the top 50 that. A bunch of editors order lunch, sit around a table, and come up with a list and throw it out there. And there's a certain amount of truth to that. Rolling Stone does it all the time. The top 50 albums of the year. Well, their top 50 might not be your top 50 or my top 50, but it's a fun thing, and it sparks conversation, and it's always interesting to see. Well, what do they put on their list? And we kind of took that to heart. We do that all the time with lists at the year-end issue, and I think we did Book of Lists issues in other magazines. So we played with lists quite a bit over the years.
Yeah. One thing I also wanted to ask you about was we were talking before about lobbying from promoters and that kind of thing.
Sure.
Can you give me some of the story about WWF and the ban and them being removed from world title recognition for a while? What do you remember about that?
Oh boy, that was sort of an issue that kind of consumed the office, I think, for a number of years.
Because you're in New York too, right? So it's your backyard.
Exactly. It was our backyard. It was, personally, I felt it was very unfortunate. I think, for WWF to do that, I get it. They were doing their own magazine. They wanted control over their own product. But, we weren't doing anything. It's not like we wanted something they didn't want. All boats rise with the tide. We wanted wrestling to be successful. We wanted their stars to be big. We wanted their big stars to be bigger. I guess they felt that, we were sort of riding on their coattails, and they didn't want any part of that. So they didn't, not just us. They shut everybody out of the garden for taking photos, and so we did things. We would take photos from the stands. One of one of my favorite photos that I ever took was from the stands. It was actually before the ban, I believe, but it was Snuka jumping off the cage onto Bob Backlund. And I think they printed that photo 14,000 times in the magazine. But it was. I think it was a bit of a tense time. It was a time where, for the first time in the magazine's history, we really had to start thinking about, in some cases, legal ramifications of what we were doing, and we certainly didn't want to get sued by the WWF. I mentioned earlier, we were all, when I started at the company, 81, we were all young guys out of college, and we kind of grew up with the magazines, and I think that was sort of a time of, hey, you're an adult. This wrestling industry is turning into something that it's never been before, and we have to play by some different rules here. So, we figured out how to play by those rules, and we did a little more emphasis on some of the other promotions. De-emphasizing the WWF World Title, I don't know. It was like an angle being run in our own magazines, right? I don't know if that was anything, good or bad. It caused some controversy, but my 2 cents, probably more trouble than it was worth.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was sort of an interesting time, and that's at that time a lot of the coverage of WWF became very. I shouldn't say legitimate. That's sort of a bad word to say. Maybe more pointed. So you had the steroids thing happened around that time. So Vince McMahon was in court. So we sort of had to figure out how do we cover that without covering everything of it, because the everything of it wasn't really what our magazines were about.
Right.
We were really focused on what was happening in the ring, but certain things happen, and you really can't ignore them. So that became the source of a lot of very interesting conversations in the office. Okay, we're going to cover this court case.
Yeah.
How much do we cover? How much? How far do we go in covering it? Those arguments. The arguments about the Oxford comma sort of gave way to arguments about testimony in this case or that case.
Yeah.
The John Stossel incident. How much do we cover that?
Well, let me ask you on that point, and then you get the rise of some newsletters, right? And I know to some way they were always around, or certainly around for decades, but the popularity of the Observer and the Torch and so-called legitimate wrestling journalism. How did you guys receive that? Did you see it as some kind of threat? Did it make you kind of question your mission statement and your relevance?
No, not at all. It wasn't a threat at all, because they were serving a very different sort of audience than we were. We got them all the time, though. We got Meltzer every week. We got the Torch every week. We got all the newsletters. There's a great one, Chuck Shepard's wrestling newsletter. I don't know if you've ever seen that. Chuck Shepard is a guy, he's syndicated to this day, with a weird news column around the country. And he took this real snarky, tongue-in-cheek approach to wrestling in his newsletter. He would do things like he would have a full-on word-for-word transcript of Jimmy Snuka interviews, and unintentionally some of the funniest stuff you ever read.
Right.
But no, to get back to the Meltzer and Torch, it was a sort of a different mindset, and there was kind of a very clear separation between what we were doing and what the newsletters were doing.
Right.
That separation became less so over the years.
And you guys experimented with a weekly newsletter also, right? I mean, there was the PWI Weekly
for
a while.
Yep. Yeah, there was PWI Weekly. That was a pain, I'll tell you what.
I can imagine. That must have doubled or tripled your workload, I imagine.
Yeah, that was a lot of work. It was a lot of results. It did okay, but I think it was trying to take sort of the magazine mindset and put it into a weekly newsletter. And when weekly newsletters like Meltzer and Torch were giving the results plus so much more, it was hard to compete with that.
Yeah, I guess part of it was an attempt to try to be more timely, which is something to this day that we struggle with, and maybe become more of a problem in the age of the internet, where there's really, as I said before, in some cases people are finding out about title changes through the magazines. That's just impossible now. So now you really have to find these features that are a little more evergreen. But at the time, I mean, how much of that was a consideration? How old is this going to be by the time that would you be getting heads up from promoters? Look, we're going to write a story about so and so being champion. It's going to come out in 6 weeks, and maybe get a nod. You might not want to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. That would certainly happen on occasion. The time lag was sort of the shadow we labored under constantly.
Yeah.
Because we just knew that the story we're writing today isn't going to hit the newsstands for 2 months, and that was just a horrible thing to deal with in certain ways, just because of exactly right. If someone if someone you think is going to lose the title, or if you sort of have a sense a feud is winding down, do you want to do a story about that feud because they may be on to other feuds 2 months from now? Occasionally, we would do things where we'd produce the whole magazine, we'd send it off to the printer, and we would get we would get a proof back from the printer before they went to publish the actual magazine. And they were called brown lines or blue lines. It was just a proof copy of the magazine. And we would occasionally swap material out at that stage.
Yeah.
Even so, a month it's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough to deal with. So yeah, that was something that was always a concern. So evergreen stuff was always something that we loved doing. So wrestling superstars, for example, the cornerstone of that magazine was Dream Match.
Right.
That was great because that was all evergreen.
Yeah. And you'd have a lot of the art too. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you, before we started talking here for the podcast, we were chatting a bit about early forays into the internet with PWI. Do you remember a time where that became part of the conversation? At least, what this means for us, the immediacy of wrestling news sites, that kind of thing. What does this mean for Pro Wrestling Illustrated?
So I remember, I was involved in the internet, so to say, very early on. I always tell people when, I started getting involved online when Prodigy was the next big thing.
Yeah.
And I kind of sensed, I didn't know exactly where things were going or what was going to be, but I just sort of knew in my bones that, online is where all this stuff is going. And I really was kind of pushing hard for the company to get a PWI website or just a general website, or do something, get involved in online, just do something online, sort of establish a beachhead there. I wound up leaving the company, not for that reason at all. It was a whole other reason with a whole other non-wrestling magazine. That was sort of why I left. But I left and wound up becoming manager of content and online marketing for Feld Entertainment, which owns Ringling Brothers Bar and Valley Circus, produces all the Disney on Ice shows, does a whole bunch of stuff. And so I sort of, I knew publishing was going online, so I made my personal move online at that time. Since then, I haven't followed it as closely, obviously, as when I was working there. But I see there is a PWI website. There is, there's this podcast.
There's a podcast I hear.
But there's a million wrestling websites out there, right? There's I'm sure we all know who and what they are, and there's no lack of information. It's actually, the pendulum has swung in the opposite extreme of what it was. Like what you were talking about, right? You're growing up in a certain area of the country, and the only